Before we get into our discussion, it's important for us to state that the Higher Education Reform Experts South Africa is a European Union-funded project. The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of our guests and our guests alone. They do not represent or reflect the official policy or position of HERESA or the member institutions and organizations by whom our guests are employed. Unless otherwise stated, HERESA does not endorse, approve, recommend, or certify any information, view, product, process, service, or organization presented or mentioned in the HERESA podcast. Welcome to the HERESA podcast, where we'll have engaging, stimulating, and hopefully worthwhile conversations on issues, themes, and concerns in higher education. My name is Kanya Mdletye, and I am the Media Liaison Officer for Technological Higher Education Network South Africa, or THENSA, which is a coalition of technology-focused institutions based in South Africa. I'll be the host of this conversation, but in future we'll have a number of other hosts featured on the HERESA podcast. For those of you who aren't in the know, HERESA is an Erasmus Plus capacity building project for higher education, which THENSA established in partnership with Orbial Global Observatory in Spain and the South African Qualifications Authority, or SAQA. As a pilot project that will take place over 3 years in THENSA's member institutions, HERESA seeks to build a network of higher education reform experts in South Africa based on the Higher Education Reform Experts model in the EU neighborhood. This edition of the HERESA podcast is part of a new series we're running titled Young Academics in the Age of COVID-19. This project seeks to trigger conversation amongst young academics from HERESA's member institutions around the challenges they faced during the pandemic. Through the use of dialogue-inspired learning, the Young Academics podcast endeavours to discover how each of our guests have dealt with the various restrictions put in place by the government, what they have learned from the transition to online and remote teaching and learning, and what higher education institutions can do to better prepare themselves for future pandemics and disasters. We hope that this medium can provide a platform for the experiences and voices of early to mid-career academics. Today, I have the pleasure of welcoming the two academics who will be joining us for the fourth and final episode of this edition of the Young Academics podcast. First up, we have Mx Nkosana Tshisa, who is a lecturer in business management at the Central University of Technology. And rounding up our two-person panel is Ms Zizipho Mdletye, a lecturer in media, language, and communication at the Durban University of Technology. Young academics, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having us.
Of course. So in the last 3 episodes we've been fortunate enough to hear from a variety of young lecturers at higher education institutions who dealt with the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic in different but sometimes similar ways. It was very enlightening to hear from a diversity of academics, some of whom started their teaching careers at the beginning or during the pandemic, others who had a significant experience with emergency online and remote teaching, and then some whose teaching philosophies were totally changed by this dramatic and unprecedented event. I think it's very critical for our viewers, or listeners rather, to get a sense of what it was like on the ground for young lecturers when COVID-19 first struck. So I guess my first question is, what were your immediate responses when your institutions announced that you would be transitioning from in-person teaching to online and remote teaching modalities? We'll start with you, Mx Tshisa.
Thank you, Kanya. I think at first, it was a bit daunting. I'm not going to lie. It was a bit daunting. And because, the transition was quite sudden and we were all basically functioning in survival mode. I personally was worried about internet access, because data is quite expensive. And of course, not everyone has access to the internet in this country. There's also a lack of access to facilities that make a part of the holistic learning experience. So I wondered personally if, first of all, if this would work. Would our students still be able to get quality teaching and learning given the strenuous health circumstances we found ourselves in? So yeah, those I think were some of the things that were going through my mind and that I was experiencing personally throughout the transition.
Ms. Ndletye?
Okay. I do agree with Mr. Tshisa that it really was daunting. I think the fact that it's not something anyone had anticipated, or planned for that matter. So it was literally a matter of just diving in and trying to find ways to adjust our learning to suit the needs of the students and the educators as well. So it was quite rushed, but also an eye-opener in terms of just always being ready for change in any work environment, whether we're looking at the higher education sector and the other industries that needed to adjust as much as we did. So it was daunting. I think also it came with a bit of excitement for the new changes that were being implemented. And I guess just learning about more technological and innovative ways of teaching and engaging with students and administering assessments that would still, achieve the learning outcomes that we'd set at the beginning of the semester, irregardless of the fact that we were seeing the students face-to-face or online. So it did take some adjusting too, but I feel that in the end, we just, it's a matter of just diving and you decide if you're sinking or swimming type of situation.
Right. My second question would then be, did any of you engage in discussions at your institutions or amongst colleagues about your preparedness for this transition to online and remote teaching and learning? And what were the nature of those conversations? Were they more informal or formal? How did you make sure that you individually, as an academic, were prepared for what was to come? Anyone can take this question.
Well, first of all, the discussions that I took part in were mostly, informal amongst colleagues. We never really had discussions as an institution, but normally it was actually we did have discussions as an institution, but normally they were from a communique perspective where we would just hear from management on, all right, as we're all aware, this is currently happening and this is what is expected from our staff and all of that. But I think in terms of us discussing our preparedness and how we were going to get through the whole experience, I think I engaged quite, intensively or extensively with colleagues informally about that, where we would discuss the challenges that we faced daily, such as, because we did have online platforms before, but we were not utilizing them as much as how we did when we, went into the whole pandemic and when we went into online and remote teaching. So a lot of us found ourselves having to, increase our skill set, having to teach ourselves new ways and more innovative ways in which we could administer and create the same learning environment online as we did with contact teaching. There were also challenges in terms of student attendance and a lot of students not attending the online classes because maybe they were technically not ready for it, or they were experiencing some connectivity issues or some network issues, and some would, fall ill and would be unable to attend class, and then they would then later notify you that they were unable to attend class because they had COVID. So, a lot of those things sometimes you go through alone and you have no one to talk about with, but then it's really great when you have a fellow facilitator or lecturer that you can just talk about those things, and they can tell you how they got through it and what were some mechanisms that they utilized in order to ensure that they cope and they help their students cope and become productive and reach their goals.
Right. Ms. Ndletye?
Okay. For me, it's a bit of a different situation because even though I was lecturing prior to me joining DUT, I joined DUT just after we had gone through the process of changing from face-to-face to online classes. So I do agree that largely the engagement did come through emails that were sent to us to say that this is where we are, these are the introductions, these are the learning management systems, and obviously we found ourselves having to use them more regularly than previously. So the engagement largely took place, I think, at a departmental level, as well as with the support departments that were obviously there or appointed to assist us with the transition. And of course, it also happens amongst us and the students. So I also think we need to look at what type of engagement are we referring to when we look at the discussions that were taking place. There was, of course, a lot of anxiety that came with online teaching. There were colleagues that were familiar with online teaching. There were colleagues where you found that it was a new experience to them completely, and they had to adjust from very minimal use of online learning management systems to now having to use it on a day-to-day basis. And I think some of the discussions took place really as we went through the pandemic and went through the experience of online learning. As we said previously, it's nothing anyone was really prepared for. So I think we were all learning and sort of trying to find our feet in terms of finding out what works, what doesn't work. For example, I'll use WhatsApp as a tool that a lot of academics were looking at incorporating to just supplement what they were using, what they were using as platforms to teach, such as MS Teams, Moodle, and etc. And we found that, of course, experiences are unique, but we found that it doesn't work, for various reasons. I think those were some of the discussions that we looked at: what works, what doesn't work, how is everyone experiencing this new, sudden, and unprecedented change. And sometimes there wasn't even a lot of time to even have discussions. A lot of the discussions that were taking place were there to train people on how to adjust to this so-called new way of life, and how to make sure that we finish the semester effectively and get things done regardless of where we were teaching and regardless of the new challenges we were experiencing in the new platforms or the new manner of teaching we now found ourselves having to deal with, and also how frequently it was happening. Because I, for example, was familiar with online learning. I was teaching evening students, but it's not something I did on a day-to-day basis. And, having to now work in isolation and not see people, obviously affected us in different ways. But different discussions were taking place for various needs and at different levels of the experiences we were having with the transition.
Right. I think from what I've gotten so far in our conversation, you've both hinted at some of the challenges you faced during this transition, most of which centered on being alone, most of which centered on being kind of in isolation from your colleagues, from the institution, and still having to have the responsibility to educate your learners. But I guess my question would be, what were some of the most challenging parts of this transition that may not be immediately clear to someone who isn't in the higher education world? Like, what was something that took you as surprise for being challenging? We'll give it to you, Ms. Mdletye.
Okay. So in addition to some of the things that we have highlighted, I think, sorry, I just need to cut that call off. Let me actually put my phone on silent. It's the issue of access to technology, access to the internet, and access to some of the other learning resources that students need. I would say that from the perspective of a lecturer, I felt supported, in terms of being given the resources I needed to get my job done. For our students, I guess it was a different experience for them because they largely work on campus. They use the resources on campus to get things done. So, they might have different feedback to provide from what I am saying. So we found that the students didn't have internet access, or they themselves were not fully knowledgeable on how to use the learning management systems. And because, like we said, this is not something that anyone had planned for, there wasn't really adequate time to train people about this transition. There wasn't adequate time to sort of provide attention to the different needs the students as well as the educators had. And I think anxiety in general, it was such a chaotic time for various reasons. People were losing their loved ones. Like we said, people found themselves isolated. They found themselves maybe not having as much support as they had anticipated. For me, I think especially because I deal with first-year students, I do predominantly teach first-year students. They are new to the entire experience of varsity life. So just as they are starting to adjust to this new environment, they are hardly familiar with it, and all of a sudden they find themselves being carried into a completely different space that no one has prepared them for. I think it's traumatizing, to say the least, and to just find themselves having to deal with it. Like I said, it literally was a swim or sink situation. It's either you find a way to cope with this new way of life, or you completely disconnect from everything that is happening. So I would say access, resources, training, support. Some were just starting to learn how to use computers, for example, and now you are at home by yourself, and you're told that you must log on to MS Teams for a training session, whereas you were just adjusting to the basics that come with using computers, accessing your student portal. Yeah. It's a lot, especially I tend to empathize a lot with the students. I think with us, we do have our own stresses and anxieties, that we experience. But I think because we went through the varsity experience and we at least had the basics to get started, I think it was not as stressful for me personally as I would imagine it to be for my students that are predominantly coming from rural areas and that are not familiar with tertiary life, let alone having to use technology to learn and to engage with me as well as their fellow classmates.
Sorry, yeah. I think there were so many challenges, honestly. I cannot, and I think Ms Mdletye really just summarized most of them, to be quite honest. I think for me, a core challenge that I faced was honestly maintaining productivity whilst trying to survive a pandemic. And I feel like this is a universal problem that we all faced at work, where we were trying our best to show up as our best selves and to do our jobs. But at the same time, there's so much happening in our background and there's so much happening in our lives. We had students who were unable to attend lectures or access learning material due again to connectivity challenges. And I think I have never personally experienced how much this is such a problem for us as a community as much as I did during the pandemic, because, a lot of these students depended heavily on their ability to have access to the internet in order to get their education. Now, you will get data, but what happens if you find yourself being in a rural village where network is a problem, right? Or being in a household where your only escape was going to res and finding a peace of mind to study, but you have to go back to the very same place that you tried to escape from and try to achieve the best marks that you can and show up for your classes. And obviously you're unable to do this, and you're unable to leave in any case because, again, there's a pandemic happening. from our side as facilitators or lecturers, there was also assessment compilations. We couldn't use the same structure of assessments, especially informal assessments, that we did before. We had, we were just thrust into this way where we had to formulate new ways and new structures and think out of the box in order to create, assessments that would be of the quality that is expected by the school and that meets the learning outcomes. But at the same time, ensure that the students have enough time to complete it, given the challenges that they're facing, such as connectivity or, technological illiteracy and. And then there's the deadlines, where we have a particular deadline that's the same as when we had contact learning, without taking into account that the mode of teaching and learning has changed. So you have to also try to readjust to those deadlines. And there's, like Ma'am said, there's the anxieties of having to deal with that, and also being an empathetic teacher, trying to understand where your students are coming from and not being as strict or as, just really understanding that the reasons why they're unable to meet the submission days, or the reason why they're unable to attend classes because of ABC and 1, 2, 3. So the constant adjusting and readjusting was also a lot. And obviously, lastly, creating a fruitful virtual learning experience under the circumstances that I just mentioned. So you have to also change your mode of teaching, your mode of, delivering the content that you do to your students under the guise of virtual teaching and learning, which was quite a feat in its own.
Yeah. I'm so happy that you both mentioned students, because in some of my conversations with learners who started university during the pandemic, they've told me that they almost had to grieve and mourn what they thought would be their university experience. And I suppose as lecturers, besides the technological divides and inequalities, besides, the lack of access, and these are not small things, but how do you provide emotional support for your students, or is that even possible to do that in the midst of all the other things that you had to do as lecturers? If you could answer that question quite briefly.
Yeah, that's a tough one. Because I don't know, obviously our experiences are different. I think we always need to make sure that as lecturers, we find a balance, in as much as we are empathetic towards our students, and in as much as there is an understanding that we need to be there for them, and we need to almost be like, in addition to lecturing, a pillar of strength of some sort. But also, we are not professional counselors. So, there are those questions of how much do I assist? How far can I go in terms of providing support, and being there for the emotional needs of our students? What I do, I tend to listen to what their grievances are, what challenges and difficulties they're facing. And it is normal that as the lecturer, you are almost like the first point of reference, in terms of someone they feel comfortable speaking to at university, because they don't know anyone. But I just get the conversation going. But what I do is that I refer them to the student counseling department, where they are more equipped to deal with those type of challenges, and to offer further support to our students that we unfortunately do not always have the time or even the expertise to provide, because we obviously have a different set of responsibilities that we need to meet, that doesn't always allow us to go beyond those boundaries.
Right.
From my side, Kanya, I think with the group of students that I usually find myself teaching, I normally try to get to know them, usually during the first few classes during our introduction points. And I found that because, we're almost in the same age group, or we're almost, young, both of us are young, the students and I, they find it easier to relate to me some of the things they'd be going through. Of course, things that would then affect, their work or affect their performance as students. And, like the previous speaker said, I try to put myself in their shoes and I try to understand, because at the end of the day, if I become standoffish and stoic and just want my work and not willing to hear anything from the student side, that doesn't help anyone, because I could have a student that is, a really like a genius, but because of what's currently happening in their lives, that is disturbing their work at school, they're unable to show that part. You'd find that a student, for example, is struggling emotionally, and they didn't know that there are free counseling facilities, or there's a free, psychiatrist on campus that they can go to. Or maybe a student is struggling with, money or food or whatever the case might be, and they're unaware of financial aid. Some of us might think things like NSFAS are, our common knowledge or our general knowledge, but there are those students who, like, for example, me, back when I was still a student, I had no idea about NSFAS. I was lucky enough to meet someone who told me about it, and then the rest is history. So such things, when you talk to a student and you help, lighten their burden by letting them know that there are facilities on campus that can assist them or that can help them solve their problems, that really goes a long way. And it's great when they come back to you in a few years and they say, if it wasn't for you, Ms. Tshisa, I don't know where I'd be, or if it wasn't for you, I wouldn't do 1, 2, 3. It's really great, and it's kind of like a pat on the shoulder for yourself as an educator or lecturer.
Last year, a study conducted by the Council on Higher Education, University South Africa, and the University of the Free State, amongst 1,851 academic staff at 24 public universities, found that 75% of respondents stated that their workloads had increased during this transition. From this very conversation, I can get the sense that you both were doing a lot more work than you had previously. So I'm keen to know how your workloads increased. Of course, there was the responsibility of attending to students' needs, especially because they see lecturers as the first point of call. But are there any other examples that you can point towards that showed how much your workloads increased? Mx Nkosana Tshisa?
In the beginning, the workload pretty much stayed the same. However, 2 years in, I can't exactly say the same, because first of all, we've had to take on more. For me personally, I've had to take on more subjects because, a lot happened during COVID. I'm not going to get into it, but a lot happened within the organization as well. In COVID, we know people got sick and things happened. So we had to take on more work with regards to that. We had to also act out different roles, such as trainer to the students when they're unable to use platforms like Blackboard, like Zoom, like MS Teams and whatnot. So you'd have to, say, for example, your class is 90 minutes. The first 10 minutes are like, an introduction on how to access material or how to. So those were the little things that we had to do. You'd find that consultation hours, for example, were during a particular hour when you were on campus, but now they're unlimited. The student can call you at 12 a.m. inquiring about, something from the classroom, and you have to help them out because there's exam the next day, So we had to go the extra mile, and there was something they practiced. There's a phrase they like saying where I work, where they said no student should be left behind. So we had to do whatever we could to ensure that, first of all, every student has a mark, and second of all, every student, makes sure that they are part of the classes, we stay engaged, we stay interactive with them. But of course, this helped expand our skill sets and our KPIs, and we're definitely able to perform more efficiently because we have now moved online.
Right. Ms. Mdletye.
Yes, I think almost every academic would say that the workload definitely has increased.
Yeah.
There are different reasons really that we can provide in terms of why we are saying the work has increased. I think for me, doing things face to face is something I had underestimated in terms of how convenient and quick maybe it was for both me and the students. If we look at things like just giving student a feedback, for example, maybe they've given you an activity or workbook that should assign to them. In class, it would be fast for me to just read through what they've written and give them pointers to say that maybe correct this grammatical error, or maybe structure this paragraph or sentence in this particular way. Doing that online is a completely different and time-consuming experience. But that's just one example I can think of. There are issues with registrations. Remember, as we've been saying, you spoke about the digital divide. I really love that term because it really helps us understand what everyone is experiencing during this time. For other people, it's easy for them to just fill in a form and submit it, but getting them to familiarize themselves with applying and registering online is time consuming and a difficult process for most people. And I think Mx Tshisa said that we sometimes assume that things are easy because we can do them, but that's not always the case. So I think just getting students online, getting them to open their emails, getting them to log on to the learning management systems, making sure that everyone is there and ensuring that everyone understands what needs to be done in itself adds on to the administrative work and maybe academic work that we have as lecturers. Checking up on the students, there's now additional support that we need to provide in addition to what we would deem as normal, standard support that we would have to provide students with. And also the fact that they have different challenges that we somehow must make sure that we assist them with. The one student doesn't have data, the one student has data, but they have a connectivity issue. The one student has lost a family member and they can't participate for 2 weeks or for a week of lecturing. So there was that additional support that was needed that really did add to the workload that we are expected to, of course, achieve. And I think even with things like marking assessments, I know marking has been an issue for a lot of people. Again, if you give me a paper or a script and I have to mark it physically, it's quicker for me to do that. But having to mark online is more time consuming. Maybe the system is slow for whatever reason. And having to scroll through the multiple pages, giving students feedback, checking how they've done the work in relation to the instructions that were given. I could speak forever, but I think let me stop there so we can get to the other questions.
No, I hear you. I totally hear you. How, if at all, has your teaching style changed since the arrival of the COVID-19 pandemic? In these conversations with young lecturers, I've been taken aback by how many people have told me that their teaching philosophies were completely overturned by COVID. They realized that there were certain platforms that had already been available at their institutions, but which they had not made use of. That was also a very interesting thing to hear about. So I'm wondering if you tried any different pedagogical approaches, or if you realize, there's certain things that have been at my disposal that I haven't necessarily utilized, as an educator. Ms. Mdletye.
Yes, because in as much as you'd find that, for example, you are teaching the same module, of course, the mode of delivery will come with certain expectations that surely it cannot be the same online. You cannot entirely follow the same strategies online as you would do in the classroom. So there definitely was an adjustment. In class, you can monitor a student because you are all there together. You can see who's participating, you can see who's responding to what they need to respond to. You can see who's completing the activities. Whereas online, you can see that as well. But in a synchronous class, for example, sometimes it's not always easy to monitor all of the activities. Of course, depending on what activity you have assigned. But I think the challenge for me that really forced me to re-strategize in terms of how I teach is to teach in a way that ensures that students are interacting and that they are engaged in the module. I can't see them now. So, it's easy to say, okay, I'm going through a lecture and they are listening. So that linear approach of lecturing, in terms of you just maybe taking them through certain texts, going through slides, going through a textbook or whatever prescribed material you are expected to go through in terms of the course content and the learning outcomes, is not really that advisable in online learning. Yes, you can still use that linear approach of teaching, but for me, I found that I had to incorporate strategies that made it easy for me to monitor if my students were interacting and engaging. And for example, I would incorporate things like, quizzes, polls to check if, for example, if I'm teaching, are they really there and are they really engaging or receiving what it is that I am saying. And also just factoring in the multiple resources that we find are available on the learning management systems, without, of course, overwhelming the students. I think how I also adjusted my learning with the online learning experience is to make sure that I picked and selected learning resources that were convenient for students, but that were also sensitive to the data challenges that they had. So just getting them engaged, keeping them interested, most importantly, because they are isolated, I found that it's easier for them to almost drift away after that 1-2 lectures they have with you, and you find that they forget about the module because they don't see you or see their classmates, for example. But if you give them a quiz, if you give them a chat activity that they can participate in, a discussion forum where they are somehow encouraged to remain engaged in the module, regardless of, if whether or not they see you or not, and just making sure that you don't lose them, really difficult it's difficult to get them back. And most importantly, incorporating empathy into your teaching and learning. I cannot emphasize it enough. If students feel that you don't care, you are just there to deliver your linear lecture and then let them go, it shows in how they interact with you and the module. So just being that person that they know you are there, and you really do try to go the extra mile in teaching them and getting them interested in the module, and using more student-centered approaches is what I would say I incorporated or adjusted in my online learning, or added to what I was doing in the face-to-face lectures.
I definitely agree with Ms. Mdletye on what she just said. First of all, it's really important to let the students do most of the work, because we cannot be there physically, so there's no way of actually telling if they're doing most of the work. So you have to come up with creative, innovative ways to ensure that they stay engaged and they stay, there's proof actually that they are following what you're saying, because they can switch on the class or they can log on and then just switch their audios off and their cameras off, and they're having a nice nap in the background, or they just walked away and you thought, oh, this is great, I have an attendance of 50 people. Ganti, you actually have 10, and you cannot tell this if you give them, say, a test every 4 weeks, just one test every 4 weeks, or one major assignment every 2 weeks. There has to be continuous ways and novel ways of ensuring that you keep them engaged with the material, you keep them in just engaged with everything that you're putting out in your lectures. I find that the more time students spend engaged with the content, that's the more they will learn. And you will hear it in the way that they answer your questions. You will hear it in their questions specifically in their favorite time, because they only ever know you when it's exam time, right? That's when they'll remember your number all of a sudden. So you will hear that the questions come from someone who actually knows what they're talking about. And in marking too, you will realize that, 80% of the class is actually answering in ways that shows that they know what they're talking about, other than the student who just gives out exactly what's in the book, or you can see that this person literally just only logged on to write this test. I think, secondly, an important thing that the previous speaker mentioned is interactivity, right? I found that interactivity is honestly the heart and soul of effective asynchronous learning. I normally joke and say to my students that I feel like a YouTuber. I constantly have to make sure if everyone is around, is everyone there? Please comment if you agree with what I'm saying. Mr. So-and-so, I love you, you have to you have to act a little obsessed with them, with what you're telling them. So that also shows, it goes back to the empathetic thing. That also shows that you actually care and you're not like a linear lecturer who just says one thing and expects a miracle. And lastly, to always strive for presence, man, to make sure that socially they are present, cognitively you are both present. This of course comes from the interaction that I just spoke about. And teaching wise, I had to change my teaching. Like, there are things I do now that are laughable but work. For example, 5 minutes before my classes, I will put on a playlist from YouTube, because these LMSs have other things that you can utilize to ensure. So I'll gauge the audience. So if it's the Gen Z generation versus the millennials, I would know what to use to get their attention. So I'll usually put like a playlist on YouTube, and I'll know that 50 or 100 will come watch, and then boom, class starts just as I have them. And things like that will ensure that I have their attention, most importantly, but I ensure that they get what's important from it, which of course is the learning material that is aligned to the outcomes I have to give them.
Interesting. I think for the sake of time, I'm going to try to merge the last two questions in one. So institutions have already or in the process of moving back to contact learning and teaching. And I guess what I'd like to know from you both is, how do you feel institutions can better prepare academics and learners for future pandemics and disasters? Do you think there needs to be a reskilling or upskilling of digital or pedagogical approaches at institutions? Do you think that some of the existing technologies or platforms, there needs to be some sort of course that's compulsory for both academics and learners? What are your thoughts on how institutions can put themselves in a much better position going forward?
So I'm mainly going to talk about my experience, right, at my institution. So what I observed is that there was more of an emphasis on training and or coaching with regards to, LMSs and different alternatives to teaching online when this hit. Before that, there was really more an emphasis on the styles of teaching and the methods of teaching and things such as curriculum development. But then after this hit, that's when, the training started, they upped the ante in terms of like trainings that were designed to help us utilize the systems or, maneuver our teaching methods to best be, to reach the outcomes using these systems. And I think that this was where we went wrong, because if this was being practiced even before a pandemic or before a major disaster, then a lot of lecturers or a lot of facilitators wouldn't have had the problem that they had. We have, different generation of facilitators who were struggling massively with the technology. And then we have the millennial and the Gen Z staff members who were not really struggling. But at the same time, the people that are struggling are the ones that are most pivotal to the organization, because they have the knowledge that, makes the learning better. So a lot of such things need to be addressed. I think it needs to be a continuous and consistent exercise within the institute, and that way they'll be prepared for anything. There also needs to be a culture of a learning organization within the university itself or within the learning institute itself. Because ironically, in as much as we are learning institutes, we do things in very archaic ways. There'll be training here and there for like the important things that we all need in order to get through this period. But for the most part, a lot of the systems are utilized. I mean, I know with my organization that moving completely online in terms of textbooks and going green was something that was just started less than 5 years ago. That's something some institutions have been practicing for years. Institutions in Europe have been practicing this for decades. So I think there definitely needs to be a change in the way we approach training and development from an online perspective or from a technological development perspective.
I feel like you've just answered for both of us, really. But I feel like we are very similar in terms of the institutions that we belong to. I think for me, we need to move away from being reactive.
Yeah.
In terms of how things are done generally. Maybe the pandemic was good for that sense, to just say that let's not wait for a crisis to happen before we catch on to what is done, you know, in terms of making sure that we really do utilize different learning strategies, whether they face-to-face, whether they are online, to meet the needs of everyone, really. So I would say, you know, for future purposes, let's maybe not wait for a pandemic to happen before we say, okay, now we're going digital.
Right.
It is really important, and I really love what the previous speaker said about staying you know, on par with what's happening in terms of teaching or educational and technological advancements, and making sure that we are implementing what is regarded as, you know, the general standard of how learning and teaching is taking place. So without repeating what has already been said, I would say in future, let's not wait for a pandemic. Let's not be reactive. Let's try and generally make sure that we do things in a manner that is current, as opposed to only rushing and panicking in last minute to say what's actually happening. How else can teaching take place apart from, like was said, this very traditional and archaic way of doing things. So maybe it's a good thing to say that it gave everyone a wake-up call, and to say that don't be comfortable in saying that this is how I was taught it needs to be done 10 or however many years ago. And let me look at what is actually happening in my field, what is new, what further innovations have been introduced, and what can I do, or how can I use them to make learning a more effective and maybe enjoyable experience for myself and the students, and not to be set in my ways. Yeah, so being open to change and implementing the change as well. Okay, I don't know what's happening.
Hi, Kanya, you're with us? I think she might have been disconnected. Yes, she was.
Looks like she's back.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. I'm not entirely sure what happened, but I think that's a good note to end on. Young academics, thank you so much for your time, and my sincerest apologies for the technical difficulty. Thank you so much. I wish you the best.